Good morning, everybody. If you are joining us for the first time this morning and we're not present for our seminar from 9 to 10, welcome. Today's speakers are Dr. Shannon Dora Billiot and Dr. Meredith Powers. They gave a seminar presentation this morning from 9 to 10 at our normal seminar time about embracing an ecosocial worldview. If you missed that presentation, it will be on our Sweatland website, and I will put the link in the chat box where it will be. I will be uploading it by the end, probably by the end of today, to be honest. But if I don't get to it, it will absolutely be up by the end of this week, and feel free to watch that as well. So this is going to be a training consultation session. It will be 90 minutes, and our speakers this morning are going to be exploring with us current and historical environmental concerns and injustices, especially at the intersection of racial and economic justice. So Dr. Powers and Dr. Billiot will be helping us critically reflect on worldviews and consider shifting to more fully embrace this ecosocial worldview. And they're going to offer ways to apply this ecosocial worldview to teaching, practice, research, and policy changes through avenues of citizen engagement and structural activism. So I am going to go ahead and mute myself and let our speakers present. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great, thank you. It's good to be with you again for this training session, and hopefully it'll be a little bit more dialogue. We'll recap a little bit for those who weren't able to be at the seminar previously, but then we want to jump into a little bit deeper on the actual applications of an ecosocial worldview, and then have time for you to chat and ask questions and speak to each other. We can learn from each other as well. So yeah, if you want to advance to the next slide, please. Again, we want to just pause and thank and acknowledge those who are the contemporary elders and UNCG. I'm in Greensboro in North Carolina. It's a contemporary community of learners situated in a network of historical and contemporary relationships with Native American tribes, communities, parents, students, and alumni. And we acknowledge that the land that we gather on has long served as the site of meeting and exchange amongst a number of Indigenous peoples, specifically in our area, the Kiawe and Saura. And I would also like to acknowledge Indigenous and First Nation peoples worldwide whose land, winds, and waters we now all share. I would like to pay respect to their beliefs and values and the continuing and enduring cultures which deepen and enrich the life of our global community.
Aluto, Seyu, Chafayat, Sayanta, Beu, Uma Seya, Berg, Ame, Tele. Hello, I'm Shannon Dora Billiot. Thank you so much for being here. I really enjoyed the first segment of today's presentations. So I'm located at Arizona State University. We are on the ancestral homelands of 22 tribal nations in Arizona who have inhabited this place for centuries, including the Akamel Ohotham or Pima and Pipash Maricopa peoples. ASU seeks to embrace our place, connect with tribal communities, and enable success of each American Indian student. We reaffirm the university's commitment to these goals and acknowledge that everyone, the entire ASU community, is responsible for their achievement. I also acknowledge and pay respect to Indigenous elders, past, present, and future, who have stewarded this land throughout generations. And please excuse my dogs. This is their running time, so they will be running back and forth. Dr. Powers.
Great, thanks. Okay, so since we have a little bit smaller group and during a training consultation, we could get a little more intimate, we thought we'd do a little icebreaker. So sometimes when we talk about the environment or environmental justice, those kind of concepts get a little lost in sort of the theoretical or scientific nature of it. So when I speak about nature, I was going to see if you could connect to something you cherish. So if you could think about it for a moment, and you can put it in the chat box, maybe we could read out a couple out loud, but what is something that you cherish in nature? peacefulness, water, fresh air, the sun, trees, absolutely. Sunshine, all colors, seasonal changes, everything. This is beautiful. Quiet, green. Yeah, I probably missed reading out loud a few of them. Absolutely. Maybe not poison ivy. Yes, there's certain things that we have to learn to navigate around, not necessarily cherish. Yes, good. Thank you. Beautiful. Four-legged and winged animals. Yay, Shenandoah. Absolutely. I cherish flowers and sort of green trees and things like that. This is a photo I took in a local permaculture urban garden downtown. And I just love that the leaf was like a little flower, and then this opening bud just sort of signified the growth and the possibility. I took this last fall during one of my outdoor meetups during COVID, and I took my environmental justice class to see this old, what used to be an abandoned, back lot with gross trash and mattresses and all kinds of nastiness in an urban space. And they had, the owners of that land and space had asked this group to come and use permaculture methods that are helpful to the environment and sort of symbiotic within the relationship, and how it's sort of self-sustaining. A lot of permaculture really derives from a lot of indigenous ways of knowing and being. So I just thought this was a really cool picture and sort of signified not only being in nature, but also being out there with my class in nature. So thanks for sharing with me. All right, next slide, please. So just to recap slightly, if people weren't at the original seminar presentation, I know that we have a few that didn't make that. So what we're talking about when we bring up the idea of climate justice is that it's part of this bigger wicked problems, if you will. This, when problems are so chronic and complex and they involve so many different injustices. And if you pull on the thread of one, you're gonna unravel a million, and it's all so interwoven and intertwined that you really can't work on one without addressing the others. I didn't really speak to this picture too much in the last, but this is one of the pictures that I like to use, especially when I'm speaking to an audience that doesn't necessarily understand their professional role working on environmental issues. Certainly you're here at this conference and probably already have a leaning in this direction, but sometimes social workers, for instance, think of themselves more in looking at the social, the political, the economic environment, and not necessarily the physical environment. So this photo just really represented, this child sitting amongst a lot of toxins and refuse and a body of water that's definitely not able to drink, and some sort of makeshift housing in the background, and a lot of industrial expansion and building in the farther background that is contributing to this pollution. And so it really helps me to help others unpack and see their roles and responsibilities in understanding these wicked problems. And maybe they want to work with children or older adults or medical issues or whatever the case may be. But we all have to incorporate and combat these wicked problems from every angle. Certainly some of these are related and interconnected with colonialism, ableism, oppression, and violence, and based on gender, race, sexuality, a lot of the structural inequalities, obviously climate justice, which we'll focus on today, and then the economic fallout and the health ramifications of the mass global pandemic with COVID-19. So a lot of these also wicked problems are not just like problems that exist in the world, they exist in us mentally, spiritually. It really can even impact our physical health. We talked about something we cherish. I have a tree in my backyard that I absolutely cherish. It provides not only beauty, but actual function and shade to my backyard. And for the last month, we've been trying to figure out how to address it. It's an ash tree, and it has unfortunately succumbed to the plight among a lot of the ash trees that are having to be taken down in the Southeast United States area. So we have this tree that's becoming a hazard, and it's also creating a lot of eco grief or climate anxiety within me as well. And it's kind of impacting my sense of place and my own physical stress. I was talking to Shenandoah earlier, like I think I had a migraine on Saturday, and we had someone coming to potentially cut down the tree on Saturday. And I think that even created that mental, paralysis and physical illness as well. So in general, people have this ongoing and anticipatory grief related to all of these wicked problems, including ambiguous loss. We don't really know if there's an end in sight or how much, could be lost. We can't even fathom what the ramifications might be. So climate justice we see as this broader umbrella that is justice for the entire ecosystem and for future generations. It's not just about justice for the human species within the context. That would be environmental justice, which I'll speak to in a minute. And really the idea, hopefully by now, scientists have convinced most everybody that there is so much demonstrating that climate change is not just natural, whims of nature, that it really is the, acts of human activities and unsustainable consumption patterns and production and industrialism. All of this is really contributing to the exacerbation of the climate change. And it's creating disproportionate impacts on people who are already marginalized. And so obviously working towards justice means that we have to address these wicked problems of people who are already marginalized, oppressed for various reasons. And if you want to advance to the next slide. And then environmental justice is really what we're seeking. We're hoping to address ways that we can help, such as this photo here. This is one of my other former professors and dear friend colleague who worked in Uganda. This is one of the local Ugandans who is doing community-led total sanitation, and they are looking at ways to create environmental justice in the space near Lake Victoria for clean water, but also sanitation. And it was just a fun community-engaged activity that I really loved when I was doing some research during my doctoral stage. So again, environmental justice is sort of the context of humans in how the environment, either in degradation or the lack of the benefit connecting to the environment, impacts the humans. But it really is a little bit more human-centered or anthropocentric. So we really like to take a broader climate justice lens, thinking about all of the species and the whole ecosystem and future generations. Environmental racism is also a very specific piece within environmental justice that we want to lift up and highlight the need to address this. And again, this is based on race, that they would have the lack of benefit to natural environment and or more burdens and hazards related to environmental degradation, such as having landfills or being subjugated to land that was not very safe. It would be a higher risk, for instance, in a floodplain, such as the town of Princeville. So a lot of my work has been related to refugee resettlement and immigration work. And the nexus of that, I've started to understand why people started to migrate a lot of times has to do with people were at war or dealing with a climate disaster, or they were, having peace and conflict issues at war related to who gets to have access to the better land, the resources, the water, the things that they were trying to mine from the earth. And then that created the hazardous conditions and danger for people having to outmigrate and flee for their lives. So really, my entree into climate justice came from looking at climate migration. And that's really where a lot of my work is. So just one more kind of slide to talk about the issues at hand, and then we'll talk about some of the solutions and community engaged possibilities. The roots of these wicked problems we really understand as stemming from an anthropocentric worldview, where humans are kind of in the center of life and everything exists for our well-being, and we can use it with unlimited abandon. And that's a very flawed worldview. It's gotten us into these problems that we're trying to dig our way out of, but we're very entrenched. The growth ideology is sort of this economic, or it stems beyond that, even political ideology, that we have sort of this possibility of unlimited growth, and growth means good and well-being. And they look at development as the possible savior of it all. If we can fix all of these problems if we just keep growing and developing. over time, obviously people started saying, wait a minute, that might not be sustainable. Let's add a second layer to development. Let's call it sustainable development. And really, while it had good intentions and it has taken us in a better direction, it's still within this growth ideology. And so we have to really shift our worldview to embrace what we'll speak about in a minute, an ecosocial worldview, which thinks about the holistic possibilities, not the false dichotomies of like human versus nature, or different people groups even trying to say an us versus them nationalism, or just to see that we're all in this together, that we have to have holistic well-being for all. Within this anthropocentric worldview and the growth ideology, there's also overconsumption, materialism. Obviously, there's lots of oppression, structural, racism, all kinds of things, exploitation of people and the land, the water, all of the different species. And again, the measures of well-being really have more to do with situated in that growth ideology that is flawed, sort of like gross, the GDP. So we really don't have the sufficient measures of well-being within this structure either. So we really have to just completely shift, if you want to advance to the next slide. So for myself, coming from an anthropocentric worldview and my upbringing, my culture of origin, I'm not an Indigenous person. And it came to me in college when I took a class in sustainable development in my master's program in social work. And it was like this aha moment of, oh, social workers should be working on this. But I still was very much entrenched in an anthropocentric worldview. And I still saw humans as sort of outside of nature and trying to be stewards of it, but not necessarily part of it. And so it really took even more explicit research and investigation and community engaged conversations and learning from a lot of my colleagues, Indigenous and other traditional people groups around the world, that just really expanded my understanding to see something that, again, was not my own culture of origin worldview, but something that I'm trying to figure out. It's like an ecosocial lens or a worldview. And it recognizes that interconnectedness of all life in our ecosystem, and thus the fair and sustainable use of those resources. And again, not just calling them resources, but seeing them as a reciprocal relationship and well-being for all. And then that lens kind of requires us to critically examine and question those modern societal structures. Even within social work, we might be striving very hard to reinforce the systems that actually are leading to the problems that we are trying to overcome and alleviate as social workers and public health workers and chemists and whoever else you may be in the world in your perspective. So again, they're really based on that anthropocentric worldview, and we have to shift to an ecosocial lens. If you can advance the next. So again, I kind of mentioned this in the seminar, but I really encourage you. These are two of my favorite chapters that really helped me understand and unpack what is a worldview in general. Maybe you weren't even aware you had one explicitly. Sometimes it's just so much about the essence of your being that you're not even quite aware of it. So there's actually some tools, some exercises at the end of these chapters. The one is a foreword by a Indigenous woman, Miriam Scott, who I honor and celebrate, and I'm so thankful that she shared her knowledge with me and to the workbook series, offering this a fabulous chapter. It blew my mind as someone who was not coming from that worldview. It was just fantastic. So I highly encourage you to check those two out. Can advance.
Thank you, Meredith. I just wanted to check if you can put in the chat how many of you attended the seminar, because the last we checked, there was very little overlap, but I'm recognizing similar names. And so that way we're not repeating information. I just kind of wanted to see how many of you were attended. Oh, so quite a few of you. All right. So
one or two maybe said not, they haven't, so it's okay.
Okay, so one or two. All right. So I'm not going to repeat then some of this information. So maybe let's just start our dialogue then. I talked about in the seminar about how Indigenous peoples have, typically contributed the least to changes in their environment. They are located in close proximity to vulnerable ecosystems, but have the highest rates of health disparities compared to their majority counterparts. And so just as way of understanding, does somebody want to talk about any interactions that they've had with maybe not specifically Indigenous peoples, but understanding of peoples that you've worked with, communities that you've worked with who are in close proximity to vulnerable ecosystems? Does anybody want to share their perspectives or experiences with that? I'll give it a second. I know it's hard to reach, immediately start discussing.
I have maybe an example that Tina encouraged me to share. I worked on a farm in Ohio, and a lot of my coworkers, fellow farm workers, were seasonal labor. This was a farm in Ohio that traveled from a town in central Mexico called Chiquitera, Mexico, and a lot of them moved seasonally from their home in Mexico to Ohio to work because they had originally been farmers in Mexico, and the Colorado River went through their town, but because we've diverted it so many ways in the US, the Colorado River no longer flowed through their town, so they could no longer farm that land. So then they were seasonal work at this farm in Ohio. And so I wasn't working per se on near the vulnerable ecosystem, but this population was from that vulnerable ecosystem. Oh, I'm hard to hear. Sorry. Probably my mask.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you can say it again, or we can reiterate, but exactly climate displacement, and then the out migration, because the land is no longer hospitable to, their well-being. And that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that example.
Right. And it also has implications. I'm a policy person in social work. And so I think about policy all the time. And so, the things that came to my mind that I would probably talk about in my classes is, these seasonal workers have to come here for income. So what, how does the US support or really create barriers for that, for those migration workers, right? And through immigration laws or just even entry laws. And then once they're here, having access to any kinds of services. So that's the immediate thing that comes to my mind. So it's not just even the climate and things that we are doing to destroy the climate, but also things that we're doing to destroy the cultural bonds that communities may have. Either they prevent it from returning and coming back, or that they're disrupted. Their whole entire community is disrupted for that entire season. Thank you so much for sharing. So my next aspect is was to get into this community engaged research that I've done. And since many of you have heard this already, for those of you who haven't, I just want to briefly reiterate that I worked with my tribal community, United Homa Nation, for since 2011, so for 10 years now. And working with the tribal community, I knew that, or even in entering my PhD program, I knew that the work that I wanted to do, the reason why I wanted to go into a PhD program was to be able to inform policy. I worked prior to getting into the doctoral program. I worked at the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the Department of Veterans Affairs. And what I saw coming in with my social work lens was that there were very few voices at this national policy level. And whenever issues of indigenous or vulnerable populations were expressed, that it was hard to convince either those who were developing or implementing policy or those lawmakers about the depth and breadth of the need to incorporate indigenous peoples and vulnerable populations perspectives into policies to enable a sort of agency that is essential with environmental justice, the justice aspect. And so when I started my PhD program, I went to my tribal community. I first started with my family and then started reaching, and they introduced me to different leaders who then eventually introduced me to tribal elected officials to introduce me as a person who would be working as a researcher and not just the citizen who's shows up and gets food at the powwows or different events. And so when I expressed my initial desire, which was to incorporate indigenous people's perspectives in post-disaster policies specifically for mental health, the tribal council said, that's a noble idea, but what really helped for us is that we are exposed not just to repeated hurricanes. Everybody in the community can name every single hurricane, if they evacuated or not, how long they were gone, how much money they spent, every aspect of every disaster. And what happens is that we have a barrage immediately after, during, and after these hurricanes, or in the case of the BP oil spill, an environmental disaster. Lots of media and researchers from around the world, they come in, they take our knowledge, they steal our stories, and then they leave. They have these preconceptions already of what's happening, and they just fill in our words into their pre-written articles. And so no one really comes back 3 months, 3 years later and says, how have you recovered? How have you, if possible, returned to normal? What is your new normal? In addition, nobody's really looking at the slow onset of coastal erosion. Louisiana loses about 34 to 35 square miles of land per year. And Louisiana has lost about the size of the state of Delaware as far as land. You can see that from the picture of Louisiana, that we're on the Gulf Coast, and we are across 6 parishes, but we're not a land, we don't have a land reservation. We are throughout this area integrated with any other population. And so our specific voice is not necessarily one that rises to the top. And so that's the research that we want to work with. Can you do that? And I wasn't aware of, obviously I was aware of coastal erosion, but I wasn't aware of how to study that and how to integrate that with mental health or any health programs. So the tribe worked with me on my committee and with leaders, mentors at my doctoral institution to help me develop a plan for eventual collecting of dissertation data. And so it wasn't just the plan to develop my dissertation and graduate and then move on. We developed a plan, 10-year plus plan on how to meaningfully engage in the research with the eventual outcome to develop adaptation activities. And so we did this through surveys, through exploratory data collection, and then developing a adaptation or intervention that first the pilot was with women 19 to 87 years of age that has turned into a youth intervention. And so Meredith is really good at leading discussions. And so maybe if Meredith, you want to talk about and lead a discussion on, and I'm just going to scroll through these slides that we already discussed in the future, while you lead a discussion on community engagement research, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm so fascinated by your research, Nora. This is just so wonderful. Thank you for sharing. So what are some ways that some of you have become involved with community engaged research or other aspects of research around environmental health equity or environmental issues? Does anybody want to share a conversation maybe that you've been involved with or know about that would be helpful, and we could kind of dialogue with you, or even if you have a question at the moment, what are some ways that we could help support you or help brainstorm with you about ways that you could do this?
I would be happy to share something that is kind of ongoing, and we're at the beginning of. This is Brandy Phipps, by the way, speaking. I'm on vacation, so I'm not going to turn my camera on. This was important enough for me to pause my vacation and attend, but I literally am sitting in my bed relaxing while I'm attending this. So just so you understand where I'm coming from. So I actually was recently awarded a grant from the USDA. And the reason I'm bringing that up is I was so inspired by the talk earlier today. And so I just kind of wanted to mention what we're doing. So one of our main partners is a tribal college in Wisconsin. And one of the things that the co-PI that I have from that organization said to us when we approached them, and to give some background, I've had this idea for a few years now, and it just kind of all finally, it was the right time, it was the right place, right? There's so much kind of luck, I think, that goes into all of this, right, as we know with funding. And they were the first people that I called. I knew I was going to need economists. I knew that there were going to be other people that I needed, but I knew that if I didn't have them on board, if they didn't agree, if it wasn't something that would uplift and leverage resources for their community, I didn't want to do it. And I was very clear with them from the beginning and said, here's the idea. What would you like to add? What does your community want? As a woman of color who teaches at an HBCU, I'm well aware of how we often get approached as a minority serving institution to quote partner on things. And it is often not equitable partnerships. It is something that I talk about a lot. There is often a lack of understanding from predominantly white institutions, especially very large predominantly white institutions, that doesn't recognize the intellectual capacity that exists at minority serving institutions. And so I really kind of approach with this, I've been there, I don't ever want anybody else to be there approach when I approach the college. And I remember my co-PI saying, we get a lot of these requests, right, as HBCUs do, to check a box. And he said, you're one of the very first people that's ever been honest and made it a true partnership. And so, and the way that we did that is, again, it was really, what are some of the things that you've run into with your ability to get research funding? What does your community want when it comes to health, economics, in a way that's environmentally sustainable? We value Indigenous input and ethics in a way that should be on equal standing with Western empirical data. And then we sort of talked through it all. And what we ended up coming up with was funded in a really, really big and meaningful way that I think is going to serve as a model, I hope, for how partnerships work in the future. But I think, again, it mirrors what you said, Dr. Billiot, earlier in the session, which is we need to approach it respecting the knowledge that's already there and respecting what the communities that we want to engage with are already doing, and saying, how can I leverage my resources and my privilege to amplify what you're already doing? And that's really, to me, where the partnership comes in. So that's all.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that example. That's beautiful and such a great way to approach things from an authentic point of view for partnership and equitable collaboration. I think the other thing that drew me to participatory action research or CVPR techniques is that very thing, that you honor the community as the experts themselves, that you might be an outsider coming in as a researcher and maybe with some degree behind your name or something, but really they are the experts on their own lives. and approaching it from that standpoint. And I do that within my classes as well. When I'm teaching, I say that, to my students, you're an expert on your own life. You have something to contribute to the collective learning here in our community. I'm here to learn from you as well as you learn from each of us in the class. So thank you for that. Did you want to add something to that, Shenandoah?
Yes, I just wanted to say, first off, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips, for even just joining us on your vacation. I feel so honored that you would share your time with us. And then also, I think it's such a skill to be able to have the confidence and knowing that you have someone to back you up to say to, in just like layman's terms, to call out, the white institution or the partners to be able to, say, this is not how it should be done. It should be done in this more respectful way and it lays it out. And I wish that was part of our doctoral education, of our education in how to do research, is to be able to have that skill to be able to speak something that's uncomfortable for us. So thank you for sharing. I think that Dr. Summer had a comment.
Not a doctor, just a normal person, but thank you. So can you guys hear me?
I wouldn't say that doctors are normal.
I'm sorry, I'm like logged into my computer and then on my phone. So if there's background noise from this coffee shop, I apologize. But I want to go back to I had a question. I have a lot of questions, but one question I have is in regards to something that you guys, I'm not sure who said it, but there was this comment about spending a lot of time in the community, building relationships, and also like, sometimes you may be just volunteering at an event or doing something just to authentically engage in community, which I'm 100% believe is the way we should be going. I forgot to mention my background's also in social work, so I'm really excited to have social work leaders in this room sharing with us. But one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately as a center, for a little context, we've been conducting kind of an assessment on our center on how we uphold principles of community-based participatory research and our commitment to racial equity. And we're in the middle of a retreat right now with our partners that has kind of spanned over 3 separate days, where we're going to be looking at the feedback that we receive from our partners through this assessment and how we can prioritize actions for the future. But something that has come up as we try to uphold these principles and authentically engage with our community partners that I've been struggling with is just this idea of like supporting our community members. So we do a lot of nutritious food access work. We work in historically redlined communities, and we recently launched a food systems change fellowship this past year. And many of us are doing our best to support that work, both through the frame of research, but also just by authentic community engagement. Sometimes we find community partners have activities or events that we're unable to engage with for whatever reason. Maybe we have personal things going on, and sometimes that causes a little bit of tension. There's a feeling like, okay, you don't come to my events, you're not being supportive of me, even though we make our best efforts. And I'm trying to wrap my head around like, what does support look like? And not every person feels this way, but sometimes it can be like, okay, if you can't make everything that I'm engaged in, then you must not care about me as a human and coming from the institution. Like, you're just like everybody else, which is like really painful to hear somebody. That's the last thing I want somebody to think about us and the work we do. But I'm trying to like look past my feelings and just say like, okay, what's behind this and how do I respond to this? And how do we support our community members and community partners authentically, and understanding that we're not going to be able to be everything for everyone. I'm sorry, that's like a long way of saying all that, but I hope that makes sense. And I'm just hoping you can share some of your experiences in that.
Yeah, I guess I can take a discussion on that. Thank you for sharing that. That's fantastic. It is. I think that as we were talking about an ecosocial worldview, let me just start back at that first premise. academy and funding sources, as we even spoke about earlier, that they usually are not within an eco-social worldview, that they're very much about that growth ideology and more is better. And like, let's just keep doing more, getting more grants out there, getting more programs started, getting more outcomes measured, whatever the case may be. And so part of an eco-social worldview to me is actually slowing down, embracing slow scholarship, ecofeminist practice, indigenous perspectives on research, as Shane and Dora shared in the last slideshow. So again, those are the pieces that maybe it's kind of like having to be mindful myself of, like, if I can't spread myself so thin so that I only am dabbling and kind of like jumping in and out of communities and they don't feel like it's truly authentic in a partnership. So part of that's kind of checking myself. Part of it's also having more authentic dialogue and say, what would it mean to you? Like, what would you like for us to be involved in? How could we be supportive if we only have this amount of hours or this amount of capacity, for people to be involved? What would be the most valuable to you to help navigate and build these relationships? And also just sometimes it helps too to show that you respect them as the experts, that you don't have to be at everything because you're not the expert. They are the expert. That you're there to just support and facilitate and help elevate and highlight their work. And that if you can't be at everything, that's okay. They can carry on, and that they're doing amazing things and that they are the experts. So I think that might be another aspect of it. But again, the more you can see it as long-term engagement and community engaged work, the more you can build those partnerships. And it's the human contact. It is hard during COVID as well. But those are some of the things that just kind of popped in my mind as a response. But I don't want to take up all the time. If other people want to share, that would be amazing. I'd love to hear what others have to say on this.
Thank you, Meredith. I think that I would like to add, just sharing of an experience that I had, speaking about reciprocity meaning that what I do, how I engage with communities in research has a significant, meaningful intended outcome for the community is important, and also sharing as oh my gosh, I'm blanking on your name already. I'm so sorry. I'm pulling up the chat. Dr. Phillips, I'm so sorry. Dr. Phillips said earlier is about leveraging your resources. So early on in my engagement with the tribe, one tribal administrator reached out to me and said, our diabetes program is ending soon and we haven't been able to find funding for it. Do you think you can help us? And I've never worked with diabetes. I didn't even know. I knew very little about diabetes. And so I said, I don't have that expertise, but I can find people for you. And I was able to reach out to some of my mentors who do have experience with diabetes and connect them with the tribe. And that's how, in an early iteration of the Returning to Our Roots program that I talked about earlier, what started was through the lens of diabetes prevention. And so exactly right, Dr. Powers, in that, like, we're not the experts. We don't know everything. We have an expertise in our one area, but it is such a fallacy to pretend that, like, you can go into any community and know exactly what is best for them and that you're the one to do it. We're not saviors. We're researchers. We're scientists. And so there's no absolute truth, right? Like, that we know of. We're on a constant discovery to find a truth, a version of the truth. Anyway, that's my soapbox. I'll let other people continue or to contribute to any experiences on how they have been able to work with a community, especially if there's friction in going into the community. And we can continue, Meredith, if you think that we need to. Oh, Dr. Friedman, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to add and get your thoughts. I think, the concept of slow research, I really like that idea, very counter to a place like where we are at Case Western. We're especially in the School of Medicine. So every faculty member here, they say that you should have 70% of your salary covered by grants. Well, you really have to be fast research in order to do that. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be here very long. So there are these, which might be okay. It might be that this isn't the right place, but and that is totally a legit valid thing. Like maybe it isn't the right place, but let's argue that maybe community engaged researchers should be here. Maybe, if they should be here and they're in that, what does that look like? And so one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is the idea of process. And how do we elevate research on process? Because like you all talked about earlier today, I mean, it's always, it's like this, right? There's no end and no beginning to what we do. There's no point where like your BMI, I mean, we all critique BMI, but I'm just going to play it out for an example. Your BMI is whatever, 26. Tomorrow, you might have eaten a little bit of salt and you had water weight retention and now it's 26.5 or 27, right? It's all, the very second that we achieve something is the very second that, one of those strings pulled and something unraveled and it's changed. It's immediately changing. And so I guess my question is, how do we elevate studying of process? And even when I taught Meredith at University of South Carolina, I taught a community engaged research class. And the whole point of the entire class was to never start a project, but you had to build a relationship. And so the entire class was around how do you build a relationship with a community partner, and actually learning that sometimes that was the wrong partner, which is a totally valid learning, right? A really important learning. So what are your thoughts on process, especially from an Indigenous perspective, and how do we maybe incorporate that into the measures that we're the research side of what we're doing?
You want to go?
Unmuted now. Yeah, go ahead, Meredith, if you want to go first.
Oh, yeah. I guess I was just thinking about at my institution, for instance, it's not Case Western, but at UNC Greensboro, it seems to be a good fit for me as the type of scholar that I am. One of the things that attracted me to coming and taking the position here is actually that they have a tenure track position or track on applied scholarship. And so they have had these discussions trying to sort of disrupt the way that the university and academia has always operated on that publish or perish, or get the big grants or perish. But a way to honor the fact that community engaged scholarship is needed, and that we are, as applied scholars, might look very differently in our outcomes that we measure. So I've been really thankful to go up under tenure right now. It's in review for under an applied scholar. So that's another thing. If you're looking at finding the right supports from an organizational level, or maybe trying to help generate change, sort of disrupt and dismantle and transform those systems. If you're at another university or organization, that might be some conversations to be had. But yeah, I don't know. I would say that when you are doing more the qualitative, not necessarily exclusively qualitative, but in CBPR methods that are, tend to be more qualitative, it really is more about that longevity and understanding how the process itself is the intervention. It's not just like this outcome that we measure a pre and a post. It's like the process of having dialogue, of saying, hey, we are experts, not just saying, hey, let's study this phenomenon, but acknowledging that we're experts, acknowledging that we are in this together, building that solidarity, that social capital. Yeah, the process is the intervention. Absolutely. So for me, the process is just as important as the outcome. And that has to do with all of my applied scholarship, from like writing, co-authoring, co-collaborating on research or presentations, working with my students, it's all about the process as well as the outcomes. So I hear it. I want to advocate for a change and move us in the direction of measuring that and getting funded for that and whatever else we need to support the work that we're doing. You want to speak more? I know Darcy mentioned also from the Indigenous perspectives.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith. One of the projects that I'm on is funded through the National Academies of Science, and it's the Golf Research Program, and it's the money that that the United States won from the civil suit to the BP oil spill, and so that money for research was given to NAS, and they're funding all of these projects. A large aspect of the funding is for community engaged research, and so while our goal is to develop these adaptation activities to increase resilience for tribal citizens and for the government itself, we have and we spent probably the first, I would say, good deep conversations the first year of the project discussing process evaluation measurements, and a lot of that is how universities work together from various disciplines with the tribe, and how the tribe is able to articulate what they need and what steps have been erroneously or in a good way taken to be able to conduct the research in a meaningful way. And it was incredibly, it was a lot of discussion, a lot of feelings. We tend to think that scientists, we don't have feelings, but when we're all together, there's lots of feelings that come out, and that showed up in our evaluation. And I think that I didn't have direct conversations with the program officer, but it seemed like they really appreciated us documenting that strenuous process of even coming together. And Dr. Phillips made an incredible, a great point in that it's important for us, those of us who do get to that place of privilege, to be able to be on those review panels, to be able to be for grants, to be the reviewers for publications or for conferences, those gatekeepers in the academy, to be able to change those, to transform the expectations of publish or perish to slow community or engagement and research. Tim, oh gosh, I'm so sorry, Tim, I'm probably gonna.
I can barely say it myself. It's Tim Shashelsky. First off, I just want to say a quick thanks for all of the things you've said and the conversation you guys are leading. I just wanted to add a quick note to Darcy's point. I was teaching for a little while at a small liberal arts institution, and while not perfect, they did sort of dig into this different model of scholarship. It's not come into play at an R1 research institution, but there is opportunity to change a little bit of the goals of the system, if you will, the tenure system, and they have provided part of a model for doing that with the Boyers model of scholarship. A little more focused on the non-publication aspect of what you bring to the scholarship table. But anyway, thank you.
That's great. I know several universities have recently been researching more on decolonization within social work, but also just within academia itself, and that there's, again, trying to honor and lift up oral ways that we can document orally rather than just publish or perish. Other ways that we can involve experts who may not have like a degree behind their name, but certainly recognizing their expertise and honoring them. Shannon Dora and I were discussing the possibility of doing some research on the wisdom of our elders, looking at sustainability and and maybe documenting that through a podcast series so that it could be preserved for future generations as well. So yeah, those are the kind of things that are applied scholarship that I love doing. That's who I am as a scholar, but is not recognized at every institution. But I'm thankful at UNC Greensboro it's part of our tenure track option. So I encourage you, and I'm happy to share that with you if anyone wants to bring that to their institutions. But certainly it's true in organizations as well as in academia. So yeah, thanks. Great discussions, everybody. I appreciate it.
I know. So I think Brooke and then Brandy both have questions.
Well, mine was just a comment about the alternate roles, and just I worked with Northern Arizona University, and they have a really interesting applied Indigenous studies program that uplifts elders that have non-traditional education, that have like formal positions within the university that is just an elder title, and I just thought that that's a pretty amazing model.
I really do love the philosophy of NAU. They very much are place centered, and that they know that they can do this because of where they are located. So yeah, I love their philosophy. Thank you for sharing that. Dr. Phillips?
Hi, I just wanted to share. So I attended, I want to say it was last week, a kind of an event by the United Nations. And I keep hearing something said here that I wanted to share with everybody. And if I can find the link before we get off this talk today, I'll share it in the chat. But it was specifically about aquaculture, which is why I attended. But the 2021 World Food Prize laureates spoke at it. And there were also kind of leaders from all over the United Nations dealing with global and nutrition food security and transforming food systems to be both economically viable, but also, of course, environmentally sustainable. The focus, of course, was on aquaculture and fisheries for very good reason, because of the nutrient density and kind of the ways that aquaculture affects climate change in a different way than land-based flesh kind of systems do. But anyway, long story short, one of the speakers that I think is really important to talk about here was a First Nations representative and advocate. And he said something that I really appreciated, which was that one of the United Nations kind of strategic priorities when dealing with transforming food systems right now, which is obviously directly related to ecosocial transformation as well, is about the importance of valuing Indigenous, First Nations knowledge, oral traditions, and ethics related to sustainability and food systems as equally valuable and relevant as empirical Western data. And I was really, really pleased to hear that. I figured everybody here would be pleased to hear that, because what we're talking about here today and what you talked about earlier is directly in line with kind of the global leadership in these areas. And so when we think about funding, when we think about publishing, even if we have to do it faster than what we would like to related to slow research, I think it's important to realize that, the fire couldn't be hotter right now to strike at the iron. This is the time where it's way too late, right? It should have been long before now, but it is now. And so I think that, for those of us listening that are wanting to do this work, I think we're going to see more and more opportunities to do this kind of work and to have it be recognized. And especially when it comes to historically excluded and purposefully disadvantaged populations, First Nations peoples, Indigenous peoples in this country and elsewhere, as well as populations who perhaps are not Indigenous, but were brought here against their will, right? Having their culture and their ethics stripped from them when they arrived. Now's the time. And I think that we can be really excited about the opportunities that exist. And so again, I'm just kind of sharing that to say, I'm so excited about this talk, and I'm so thankful for both of you for facilitating this discussion and hopefully building partnerships that we can all kind of tap into moving forward.
Yeah, thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I really appreciate you sharing that. The idea that Indigenous knowledge is as equal in legitimacy as Western knowledge, I feel like was not heard as openly when I first started my doctoral program as it is now. And I feel so thankful for those leaders like the one that you heard at the UN, Dr. Wildcat, and many other Indigenous scholars who've pushed that, and all of the allies who've continued to push that and make this an acceptable part of culture, so much so that I feel comfortable writing it into my tenure statement, which I'm going to put up next year. So thank you so much for bringing that up and for articulating it in the way that you have. Dr. Powers, did you want to contribute?
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Phipps, for sharing that. That was incredible. I'm sorry I missed it. In fact, at Peacehaven Community Farm, they've been venturing more into aquaponics, and I've learned a little bit more about those closed loop systems and how wonderful they are for nutrients and for sustainability reasons. But yeah, that's fantastic. I think also, I think we took out the slide that had one of my favorite books that just really blew my mind. It's Braiding Sweetgrass. It's by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and it's in the subtitle, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. So fantastic read or audiobook if you're into that. So definitely check that one out. But again, situating Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing as absolutely equal, if in my mind, not better than other ways of knowing, because we have just really become so entrenched in those anthropocentric worldviews. So yeah, thanks. All right.
If I can just share a little bit about the research slides that I do have left, just so that way we can add a little bit more content. It is actually related. So this is the slide that you've seen throughout this discussion is from one of the surveys that we did in the beginning, looking at likelihood of adaptation activities and in response to environmental changes. And, the first three you can see are related to participants' interactions, either through commercial fishing or subsistence fishing with the environment. So they feel like it's a duty to contact public water authorities or EPA or rehabilitation efforts in relation to their job. But you can see that going down the line of likelihood of doing some of these activities, that those that are on the bottom, writing to a letter to the editor, responding to environmental impact statements, these are activities that interact with the government, but that are media, outside entities that participants didn't believe would even, their voice would not be heard. So there's this mistrust, if you will, that their voices and their knowledge would have any legitimacy, seen as legitimate, or that their agency to even do that would be respected. And so they're less likely to do any of those activities. The ones that they are likely to do are that they found more meaningful were talking to friends and neighbors, attending community members when the community initiated the meeting. But those interactions with outsiders, if it's not related to their job, they were less likely to do these adaptation activities. And in fact, they gave some examples, which were, so the housing on the left, the black and white pictures, housing that participants remembered living in, or that their parents, or some few cases their grandparents lived in, which were sustainable homes, not just because of the materials that were used, but because of how they were able to withstand the extreme weather in South Louisiana, the high humidity, the constant rainfalls and hurricanes. And so they're, made with cypress and oak trees and moss, and can easily be replaced, versus homes that are required now, especially anybody who's had to rebuild a home, that they utilize insurance or FEMA or emergency disaster money. They are required to lift their homes a certain amount depending on how close they are to the Gulf of Mexico. So this house, I think, is 12 or 15 feet above ground. A requirement for all of these above 10 feet is that they have these electric lifts. And so participants are like, this is an example of a requirement that is meant to be conscientious for those who who have physical ability challenges or limitations, but it's not actually useful in a situation. The idea is that if there's a flood coming in or water rising, that somebody needs to evacuate quickly, they may not be able to get down the stairs, but they can use this lift. But everyone's like, this is an electric lift, so it wouldn't actually be useful in a flood because water comes up so quickly. And so they point to this as an example of a requirement that is put upon them, that they'll do because they have to, but that they were not at all involved in any of that decision making. Other strategies are about livelihood, and that's in the amount, the size and requirement of the fishing vessels. And fishing in Louisiana, at least among Houma people, is the overall term that can include harvesting oysters, shrimp, crawfish, actual fish, garfish, which are, these little, the shells of garfish. And so nowadays you can't use a pirogue or a small boat to harvest these seafood, because they're not actually there in the bayous and in either for commercial purposes or even subsistence purposes. They have to use these large vessels which require natural resources, fuel consumption, as well as GPS equipment and technology equipment in order to navigate waterways that they've gone on their entire life, because the land and the water are changing so much. They need these systems. And then also this regrowth strategies that used to happen in just 30, 40 years ago are no longer able to happen. One example is the burning of marsh. Participants remember going trapping and being able to burn the marsh following a trapping season to solidify the marsh and to enable it to have a regrowth for the next season. And these controlled burns are no longer allowed, and instead the marsh is not being protected and is losing out. So I just showed just one regression chart. We looked at how demographics and indigenous specific protective or challenge barriers factors related to likelihood of doing adaptation activities. And you can see that feeling the impact of environmental changes, discrimination, ethnic identity, and exposure were all significantly related to higher likelihood of doing adaptation activities. But the highest one was this discrimination. So those who had higher levels of discrimination experiences were had an increase of 8 points on their likelihood of doing adaptation activities throughout their experiences. And so I will let Dr. Meredith Powers talk about some some practices that can be used with Indigenous or non-Indigenous communities.
Thanks. So this is sort of what I've been doing a lot with the communities that I work with, as well as my student populations. Here's a picture of my daughter. We actually just were wandering out in the woods one day and we thought, oh my gosh, what a great place. We should come back here and do some meditation. And I was with my brother and I said, well, why don't we just sit right now and do it? And she actually sat down and started doing this little pose. It was just adorable. So I had to snap a photo of her. But yeah, it's definitely part of radical self-care. I see that, Rachel. So for me, understanding ecotherapy is something that I do, again, in that, do I savor the world or do I save the world? Sort of, it's hard to plan the day, but I need to do the ecotherapy, the radical self-care, in order to continue doing this work, to work on wicked problems. It's you know, it's hard to stay engaged with communities, to have those hard conversations that are sometimes, you know, really difficult to have, and you have to own up to where you went wrong and how you can change and how you can move forward together, and not just call each other out, but call each other in and moving forward together. So for me, ecotherapy is huge. And when I'm teaching, I teach a class on environmental justice specifically, and I actually incorporate in ecotherapy as one of the assignments, and say you have to go out and do something connected with nature every week for an hour. It could be outside, being in nature, being inside with art. You know, I have some beautiful art from a former professor mentor who created that. And just, you know, objects in nature. I actually have little rocks from the beach, or, you know, seashells, things like that. So the ways that you can incorporate nature, objects, or art is also helpful for people who may have limited mobility and maybe couldn't go outside because of allergies or whatever else may be impeding their access to nature. Music, for instance, is another way that we can really connect with nature. And for me, I love photography. I love little nature photography. I'm just, you know, sort of a hobbyist, not doing anything specifically, but just snapping photos all the time of nature. A lot of the slides that you've seen here today have been just ones that I've snapped on my normal phone camera. But so the radical self-care, there's actually a couple of articles that I've been writing. And part of it is actually doing the thing to address whatever it is that's creating the eco grief or climate anxiety or stressor within you. So how can you address it? How can you alleviate that problem? And that actually is part of radical self-care. For me, part of my radical self-care is actually teaching, helping equip the next generation, and to having conversations with colleagues like yourself so that we can equip each other and gain skills and knowledge. So this is one of the, oh, sorry, go back to the quote real fast, sorry. This is one of the quotes that I think is the most fantastic, the guitar. Again, this is part of, it blew my mind with this worldview that I didn't understand until I'm starting to embrace an ecosocial worldview. But before the guitar was an instrument, it was a tree and the birds sang in it. The wood knew about music long before becoming an instrument. And I just thought that was it's a rough translation from Spanish, but that really speaks to me that, you know, we're all so interconnected. Thanks, you can go to the next one. So these are just some of the examples for teaching. You know, we do tree planting, but also, you know, literally being the change we wish to see in the world. My students created a human sign. This is pre-COVID. You can go to the next slide, thanks. And a few other opportunities that I've had to take my students outside to do the climate strike that was in 2019, the global climate strike. We did some speaking, some protests, the climate, Extinction Rebellion. And then my daughter actually spoke on stage with the Sierra Club, invited her to be a guest speaker, and she talked about bicycling in Greensboro and how we needed buses that were electric and to have less cars and fossil fuels. That was sort of the thing that she wanted to speak about. So kind of getting my daughter involved in this is also part of my radical self-care, doing it for her, but with her. You can go to the next slide, thanks. These are a couple other examples from teaching with the environmental justice class. The one here on the left in Greensboro, we're situated with part of the Underground Railroad within Guilford College. And we actually took a walking tour to visit one of the trees. It's this magnificent, beautiful tree. that's part of the historical Underground Railroad. And some of my students went with me, and we just talked about the ecotherapeutic practice of it, but also relating it back to Dr. Billiot's research, and having the returning to our roots ecotherapy with the women. I thought that was brilliant. And the top right corner is actually, and the Montagnard Dega Association has a farm here in Greensboro where a lot of the people who have resettled have been able to create food sources for themselves. This is cassava, I believe. And they said, even if you had access to a market for international, foods, that a little handful would be like $5. And so it's not, even if it's accessible, it might not be affordable. So again, thinking about food justice and how you can transfer your culture and your health and well-being, eating the things that were appropriate and meaningful to different populations who've resettled in Greensboro. So that's another aspect that I work a lot in. And the bottom picture is with the garden, again, that urban permaculture garden space that is actually creating, not just an ecotherapeutic space, but it actually provides free food for people in downtown Greensboro who might be experiencing homelessness and wandering through. It's certainly a teaching space and a model for me as I'm developing the SBC garden as well. You can go to the next slide, thanks. I don't know how much more we have. Oh yeah, so that's just a class assignment if you want to see that for your own edification, for doing something yourself or incorporating into classes, or maybe as a continuing education opportunity or a group project if you're just at an organization and want to do some ecotherapy and talk about it together. But again, I incorporate it as an actual graded class assignment and tell my students they have to work on this, because studying these projects, it really creates a lot of eco grief. I had a student call me one semester crying, saying, she was studying about the horrors of the fashion industry and that she couldn't finish her final paper. And I said, okay, let's dial it back, work on some ecotherapy for yourself. Tell me about the problem very briefly, and then quickly get into who's working on the solutions. How can you join them and kind of move forward? So I realized right after that I needed to add that. And this is just one of my slow down in life, radical self-care, ecosocial worldview. Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. So here's the slow scholarship, slow community engaged processes and research. And thank you for being with us today. If there's any more questions, we can open up the floor. Oh, this research needed. You want to share that one, Tandor?
Sure. So we do have a lot of information about theoretical information, but we don't have our specific measures. And we know that Western science really values these quantitative measures. And so we don't really know the extent quantitatively which a population, not just Indigenous peoples, have health and health disparities to exposure to environmental changes. We still don't have a clear idea of what motivates individuals to take climate action or do adaptation, individual level adaptation activities. And we know that lots of communities and even sections of whole countries are having to migrate because of our climate. And so what is that motivating factor is, in Louisiana, there are people right now from Hurricane Ida who are using tents to stay on their property because their home is gone, and they refuse to leave. So what are those indicators that are final situations that inspire somebody to move? And should we be requiring that all who experience extreme exposure to environmental changes move? And we have land-based interventions in New Zealand and Canada that have not been incorporated into mainstream research here in the United States. And so we hope, as those of us who are doing these ecotherapies and through wilderness can expand land-based healing interventions, moving away from individualist to collective action, and embracing ecosocial worldviews, as well as expanding conceptualization and measurements of well-being. So we now can open it. We have our contact information that we shared in this last seminar, as well as some resources and our acknowledgements. And so if we can open it, the last 8 minutes that we have left for some discussion, I would really appreciate that. Now, Meredith is really good at facilitation, so I'm going to let her do that part.
Yeah, and I was chatting with a few folks in the chat box to say, we're happy to collaborate or to reach out or brainstorm with you or learn more from you. So please get in touch with us. And I think we shared our contact information in the last one, but we'll pull it from the slides and put it in the chat box here again as well. Yeah, see somebody has their hand raised. Go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us your work. I just wanted to find out, like, as far as funding, I know your work is like great research and some ways you've said like radical like approaches. How are you able to secure funding? Is that like a challenge when you're trying to get funded? Like how do you leverage like these great ideas for like other like funders or reviewers who don't see the same like view to like say, yeah, we are going to fund this?
So I'm not sure if you were in the seminar, but I shared that I did do, I have submitted the same grant application 4 years in a row to NIH, and the last level got recommended for funding at the director's level for NIMHD and was not ultimately funded, mostly because they said that HOMA as a population was too small and that I needed to have a comparison population. So I haven't been able to get funding from that sort of entity, but we have been funded through the National Academies of Science, through the Golf Research Program. And it's mostly because they are more open to understanding Indigenous perspectives and perspectives along the Gulf Coast. So, so I don't really have, I don't know that I have like words of wisdom on how to get funded through government sources. I think that you have a really great resource there with Dr. Brandy Phillips, who has been successful in that realm. And so I would love myself to even hear her perspectives on how she was able to do that funding.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm the best person, quite frankly. Yes, I was funded, but still pretty early on. And like I said before, I think that a lot of the time, it has to do with whatever somebody in the reviewer's office is excited about at that moment, right? And how your project happens to fit in with, with kind of what is hot in that moment. But one thing that we have found, and I have had pretty decent luck, even being early on in my career with research, getting funded so far, is partly you need to treat writing your grant as an exercise in marketing. How are you going to get somebody to champion you, right? And so every single part, so I thought of, okay, I'm going to write the summary in a way that I'm going to get somebody to read this and be obsessed with it and want to read more. And then the very first page of my project narrative, how can I word this in a way that really makes them want to champion this when they go into the triage area? And so I think that, when I heard you say, they said that population is too small, et cetera, I wonder, in cases like that, if you could expand and bring on partners that want to do similar things with additional populations, right? And so then now you have larger populations, you're having a kind of a wider impact, and you can then sort of address that concern that they might have, whether I agree with that concern or not, and I don't, but I'm not the funder, right? So if you can find a way to take what they're saying and then say, okay, how am I going to address that so that they can't use that excuse the next time? And so I was even thinking when I listened to you present about the kind of the health and wellness, which is obviously a field that I am very interested in and have experience in, I was thinking about ways to potentially contact you after this and expand on what you're doing and potentially kind of have what you're doing happen in multiple communities around the country that have experienced similar disconnect from their cultural roots. And I think that there's some real value there, which you've already shown. And I think doing things like this is a way to build those partnerships and bring in other perspectives and find ways to expand on the research in a way that, sure, we can kind of keep it slow, but at the same time, we're in the system that we're in. And so we have to function within it, even while we're trying to position ourselves in ways to disrupt it. And so how do we do that? And I think having discussions like this, I love the Sweatland Center. I love what they're doing and how they bring people together in this way so that we can have these conversations and build these partnerships so that we can do that. So I think even just those of us listening, if we say, oh man, that's something that I'm interested in, and I have this area of expertise, perhaps we should talk, do that, like make those connections and don't just say, I'm going to do it and then let your day and your week get away with you and then you don't ever make those connections. So again, I don't have a whole lot of experience. I've been very fortunate and I'm very humbled that I was able to get the funding that I did to do something that is really my heart and soul. But I'm happy at any point to make connections and talk about what I did or what I found didn't work with anybody who would like to. But there's people here that are way more funded than me over the years that have probably better things to say.
Thank you so much for your feedback. I think one other thing that I wanted to say is like, I'm originally from Ghana in West Africa, and listening to you and your presentation about the indigenous community and doing research and all the adaptation, it kind of resonates with a lot of the things that happen in our country with adapting Western culture and, you know, planning and zoning, like laws, and people are like, why do I have to do this? Just because this is a zoning regulation that we want to adapt. So yeah, I can definitely like see like if like you want to like expand your proposal and like include larger population, we could probably look at some communities in Ghana and see like how they are adapted to some of these westernization. I think also even with immigrant populations, like if you compare like people who lived in Ghana and those who have moved here, you will see like a clear change in like their diet, their health. And obviously I feel like those who live in the rural communities, eating from their farms and doing all those like active farm work, there's definitely some difference in their health and how they even consider health, what kind of medicinal treatment that they take. A lot of the time they don't use these Western pharmaceutical medicines. So I think there's also like that way to expand the population for the proposal. If you would be interested, I would be interested to collaborate.
I would love that. I would love, yes, to collaborate with both of you. That would be amazing. I'm so grateful that you that I was invited to do this presentation, to meet all of you and learn from you. Thank you. I put my email in the chat if you want to email me, or send your email and I'll email you.
Sure, I will do that. I'll send you an email.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those ideas. Also, I guess I've found a little bit of success with small community foundations or small funding sources that kind of gets your project started, and then you have something to base it on when you approach maybe the larger funding sources. So that's another possibility. Or you can piecemeal together things, and you know, I think that's another kind of growth ideology, that you have to have a lot of money to do a lot of great work, and maybe sometimes that actually slows you down or gets in your way. So maybe being creative and tapping into the expertise and the resources in the community to do some really cool community engaged work, even without the big grants, might still be possible. maybe it doesn't get you tenure, or it doesn't get you, what you need to move yourself forward, but it might still be what benefits the community. So that's a possibility. All right, well, thank you. If there's any other questions, stick around, but I can't remember. Is this one over at noon? Is that correct, Darcy?
Thank
you all.
At noon, and we have one more session, just a small group, but I just want to offer gratitude and thanks to you. I thought particularly like this format because of the intimacy and just the opportunity to have this kind of deep dialogue. And I'm excited to see where the relationships, I love that in the model, relationships at the top. And we do a lot of system science in our center. So we talk about relationships, and I love to see that centered in the work that you're doing. So hopefully if relationships were seeded, we have no idea where they go. Like the tree and the guitar, it already knows, but we will find out someday in the future. And so thank you for this opportunity, and for Shannon, Dora, and Meredith. A small group of us will see you. I don't know if it's 12:30 or 12:45.
It's 12:30.
12:30. Hopefully you can eat a tiny little bit.
Yes.
Great. Well,
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you all for joining.